Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. We'll guide you through the ups and downs of note investing and teach you all about the nitty-gritty details of the business that other people won't talk about. Your host, Dan Deppen, is a former aerospace engineer and product manager who transitioned away from cubicle life to full-time note investing in 2018. Our website is www.fusionnotes.com, where you can subscribe to this podcast, comment, and find links to other information on note investing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Deppen, and today I'm going to be going over some note investing case studies. So I've done a few other episodes on case studies. They're actually some of the most popular ones, and it's been way too long since I've done these. And I had a couple of note deals that I exited recently that I thought, kind of particularly interesting and unusual for me. So I thought it'd be a good time to go over these. But before I dive into those, I want to give you a heads up about an upcoming webinar I'm going to do on Wednesday, June 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern. So this is on how to get started in note investing. And the reason I put this together is I get a lot of questions from people on email and social media. And one of the most common questions I get is, okay, I've looked at some things I'm interested. How do I start? How do I approach this? And so I thought I would do a webinar and then, save it as a video and a podcast. So I had kind of a catch-all answer to some of these common questions so that when I get these questions from people, I can just point them right there and make it a little bit easier. So if you're on the Fusion Notes email list, you'll get emailed a link to that, or you can also check out the Fusion Notes YouTube channel at youtube.com/Fusion Notes, where you can either find the video there or the replay if you're watching it after, or it will also go out through YouTube Live. So I want to make sure folks were aware of that because it's coming up within a day or two of when this podcast is going to air. So getting into the case studies, I got a couple of them for you today. The first one takes place in Memphis, Tennessee, home of Graceland. So this one was a traditional mortgage note. It was a non-performing note. It was very non-performing. I forget exactly how far it was behind. And the borrower was a serial bankruptcy filer. So this borrower filed bankruptcy at least a few times in the past. I picked this up from a hedge fund that didn't want to foreclose on it because the lady was a widow. However, if you looked at the history of the loan, previous lenders had bent over backwards to try to work something out. In fact, at one point they had done a HAMP modification and the payment was lowered down to like $240. And this is a property with a BPO value of $140. Really nice looking property. If you're, watching this on the YouTube channel, you can see some photos of it. Definitely nicer than some of the other properties that I've worked with. But the unpaid balance was about $130,000. The payoff amount was around $160. And I picked this note up for $69.5, which was about 53% of UPB. So, but really nice property, a nice part of Memphis, 3-bedroom, 3-bath, 2,400 and some square feet, but very non-performing with kind of a problem borrower. So because I knew that this borrower had filed BK multiple times, I assumed that she was going to do it again. Before buying a loan, I had a conversation with my attorney in Tennessee to understand if she could file BK again to forestall a foreclosure, and she could. So my game plan here was to buy the loan, start the foreclosure process immediately, trying to get the borrower to basically trigger the borrower to file another bankruptcy so that we could get that process started so that I could then, when she doesn't follow through on the bankruptcy plan, get the bankruptcy dismissed and then go ahead and complete the foreclosure. So when borrowers file bankruptcy, it can take quite a while, sometimes several months between when they file bankruptcy to when the bankruptcy plan gets put together to when they don't follow through on the plan and then until you get it dismissed and get relief of stay. So I was kind of expecting this to take a while. One of the upsides of Tennessee is that it is a fast foreclosure state. So once you can get to the foreclosure part of it, then it's pretty fast. And, reinstatement, rehabbing the borrower really wasn't coming into play on this one. I mean, based on some of the history of the borrower, that just seemed like that was not going to happen. I mean, the previous lender did the HAMP modification and lowered the payment to almost nothing. And then her attitude was, nah, I'm still not going to pay. There really wasn't a lot of scope to work something out here. And because there was so much value in the property, I was really mostly interested in completing the foreclosure. So what happened was I bought the loan. The hello and goodbye letters went out from the loan servicer. So that's part of meeting RESPA requirements. We'll probably talk about this in another podcast, but the previous loan servicer will send out a goodbye letter. My servicer, Allied in this case, will send out a hello letter. And when those letters went out to the borrower, she just filed BK13 right away, right after I bought the loan. So that was great for me because that saved me a little bit of time in the process. I was assuming I was maybe going to have to go through all the foreclosure, then have her file BK at the last minute, right? And then go through the BK dismissal and then back to foreclosure. So talking a little bit about how the bankruptcy process works. So my attorney on this one was Edward Russell from the SR Law Group. One of the best attorneys I've ever worked with. If you have a loan in Tennessee, I really can't recommend him enough. I use Satil and Barilli for most of my bankruptcy and foreclosure cases, because they cover Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, and some other states as well, which is where I have most of my things. They don't cover Tennessee, but I was very impressed with Edward from beginning to end of this whole process. So once the borrower filed bankruptcy, so he helped getting the proof of claim submitted. That's kind of the first step in the bankruptcy process. What you're doing is filing something that says, as the lender, I've got this lien on this property, and this needs to be considered as part of the bankruptcy plan. The borrower put through a Chapter 13 plan that we approved, and basically as part of that plan says, hey, we're going to begin paying off a loan, and we're going to have a plan to also pay off the arrearages. Lo and behold, the borrower did not follow through on that plan, which I kind of expected. However, they did actually send in a couple of payments, which was sort of surprising, but they didn't send in all the payments. They didn't do everything they were supposed to. And I think they also didn't send in payments to other lenders as part of that plan as well. So they did like a little bit here and there, but they did not follow through on the plan. So Attorney Edward was able to get that bankruptcy dismissed. And then once he got it dismissed, we got what's called relief of stay. And then we're able to proceed with the foreclosure. Now, when the borrower files bankruptcy, you can't have any contact with them, right? So any contact with the borrower when they're in bankruptcy needs to go through their attorney. So there were some discussions between my attorney and their attorney as part of coordinating that BK13 plan. But then once they did not follow through on that plan and we got that dismissed, they were no longer technically in bankruptcy, then we could have contact with the borrower. So I was able to make contact with the borrower, and I tried to attempt a cash for keys. If you can do a cash for keys, it's generally better than doing a foreclosure. And there were a couple things I was trying to accomplish here. One, if you can do a short sale with a cash for keys, then that's more of a retail sale. The property is going to tend to sell more than it would at a foreclosure auction, right? Because if you go through foreclosure and someone's buying it at auction, they can't see the inside. The borrower might still be there. They might need to evict. So you're going to sell it for less. So if you can manage a retail sale, if the borrower will cooperate, then you can sell it for a higher price, which is good for you as the lender. And then that also gives you the ability to kick some money to the borrower to help with moving expenses and maybe first month's rent. So it's a good deal for the borrower as well. So I contacted the borrower, said maybe we can work out a cash for keys. She was receptive. And I said, hey, can you allow my realtor to come into the place and take photos so we can kind of see what we have? She was cooperative with that as well, which was great. So met with my realtor, let her go in, take all kinds of pictures. And it turned out the property was in pretty good shape, which was a great surprise. When it comes to these foreclosure properties, you never know what you're going to run into. And I have had more than one case where when you look at photos of the outside of the property looks like it's in pretty good shape. And then you get inside and there are all kinds of terrible surprises. So one of the things I've noticed over and over is borrowers who will either ride the ship down in foreclosure or severely delinquent and going to do a cash for keys. They tend to not just fall behind or not keep up with their finances. They tend to not keep up with a lot of other things in their life as well, including the way they take care of their house. There's a lot of deferred maintenance, often other problems, sometimes really bad ones on occasion. But this one was in pretty good shape, which was a really nice surprise. So I'm thinking, okay, I can give the borrower probably $3,000. That'll help them with moving expenses and off to a good start. Unfortunately, was not able to reach an agreement with the borrower. At one point, the borrower said she wanted $24,000 cash for keys. This was after being years behind on the loan, wanted $24,000 to go away. What's interesting was the financials on this deal were so juicy, I could have probably afforded to do that, but I couldn't do that and have that be a better deal than just going through the foreclosure process. And I just wasn't going to do that on general principle anyways. So trying to get the borrower to agree to something that made more sense, but we could never get to an agreement. It was really interesting. The borrower was very friendly, on the phone. We had good conversations, and it kind of ended with, she said, of all the people I've dealt with on this loan, you're the nicest person I've dealt with. I really like you. You're a really nice guy, this and that, but I don't want to do anything right now. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what she was thinking, right? Because if we do cash for keys and I give her a few $1,000s, she gets something. If we go through the foreclosure, she gets zero, other than, I guess, living rent-free for a few more months potentially. But I couldn't figure this out. And I know, before I go on, let me just mention one quick thing, right? So if you're new to note investing, I don't necessarily recommend reaching out directly to the borrower. Generally, you would want to do these things through your loan servicer or through your attorney. I've had a lot of experience with these things, and I've done a bunch. I understand the rules and I'm comfortable with it. So it's a little different scenario. So this is kind of a do as I say, not as I do situation. But yeah, couldn't come to an agreement, and I couldn't understand why. What she was doing didn't really make any sense to me. So I ended up going through the foreclosure process. And so, as I mentioned, one of the great things about Tennessee, it's a non-foreclosure state, very fast to get to foreclosure. So it ended up taking just over 60 days from when I sent the notice of demand to when we got to the foreclosure auction. So this is a very, very fast process, the fastest process that I've gone through, and, even much faster than the contract for deed process in a lot of states. Now, after getting through the foreclosure auction, it was about 60 days to get to that. It took me a few more weeks to actually get paid. I kind of had a big saga around that. The buyer of the auction made out a cashier's check to, I think, the county, and then they endorsed it to my attorney, and then my attorney endorsed it to me, and then my bank didn't want to cash it because they wanted the cashier's check to make out directly to me, which my attorney was kind of annoyed with because he said you should be able to cash that, but my bank wouldn't cash it. So I had to FedEx the check back to my attorney, who then deposited it in his bank, and then he FedExed a check to me. And that whole process took a while. It's one of those annoying things you run into with notes. Like, you would think the process of receiving a check and getting it cash would be pretty darn routine, but sometimes these are the hiccups that you run into. Now, the whole question around where to set my bid for the auction was kind of an interesting one, right? So there's some strategy. So I mentioned I kind of know it's going to sell more in a retail sale. I know it's going to sell less at a foreclosure auction. So the question for me was, I had my realtor look over it. Well, the realtor was pretty confident it would sell for $165 in a retail sale. So I looked at that $165 price. I knocked it down to $160 because nothing ever goes quite the way you expect. And then I was going to have selling costs. And so I was going to net, I forget exactly now what the numbers were, maybe like $150 from that, or something north of $150, between $150 and $155. And so the question is, I can get this $150 to $155 if I don't sell it at auction. However, I might have to wait to do an eviction, which was going to take another 2 to 4 months. The eviction was going to have some additional costs. There's the risk that the borrower, something happens to the property or there's damage. So the question became, what will I accept now versus this 150 to 155, maybe 2 to 4 months later with some additional risk. And I decided if I could sell it for $130,000 now, I would be happy. And ended up, there was one bid at auction. It sold at auction for $130,001. So that's actually good for me because I got the price that I was happy with and I was done with the deal at that point. So let's look at some of the numbers, right? So my cost basis for the note, so I paid $69,450 for the note. I incurred $6,770 in total holding costs. So some of that was servicing fees, forced place insurance, legal fees, which was the vast bulk of that, due diligence expenses, other odds and ends. So my total cost basis was a little over $75,000 and end up with a total auction proceeds of $130,001. So this was kind of an outlier deal for me. Not all foreclosure deals work like this. In fact, a certain percentage of them actually go upside down because you find out the property was not in good shape or you run into other issues. So please, as I go through these numbers, keep in mind your mileage may vary a lot, right, from this. This is one that happened to work out well. I just thought it was kind of an interesting one because it was one where the borrower was a serial bankruptcy filer and then went through this. Oh, and I forgot to mention too, right? I couldn't figure out why the borrower was willing to go through foreclosure. Well, the day before the foreclosure auction, she filed bankruptcy again, but because she had just been through a bankruptcy, she could file bankruptcy again, but it wasn't going to delay a foreclosure auction. So what she was thinking was that she could file bankruptcy again, delay the foreclosure auction. So I was kind of kicking myself because I was wishing that had I pointed that out to her when I spoke with her, like, hey, you can't delay this with a bankruptcy. This is going through either way. Maybe that would have brought her to the table and we could have done a short sale on the cash for keys. I don't know, but that's what she was thinking. It was kind of lesson learned for me. So anyhow, back to the numbers. Total dollar profit, $55,000 and change. It was a 70% ROI. The total timeline of the deal took 17 months. So even though only 2 months was the foreclosure, there was just the other time to get the money and the whole time to go through the bankruptcy process of her filing bankruptcy, getting the BK plan, and getting that dismissed. You'll find that bankruptcies really drag out your timeline. So 70% total ROI on an annualized basis, because this went over 17 months, it was about a 45% return. So really a home run deal overall. So this next one is in Pontiac, Michigan, former home of the Silverdome and losing Detroit Lions. And, as you can see, this property was pretty scruffy, was a contract for deed, non-performing. And this was one where I went into this with the intention of trying to rehab the borrower. And the first thing that got weird on this deal was the land contract was unrecorded. And the land contract that they sent me in the hard collateral was different than the one that the seller sent me on the soft collateral when I bought the loan. So what I found out was there were actually 2 open land contracts on this property. There had been a previous borrower where they did, I think, a cash for keys, but the seller never actually terminated the old contract. So the first thing that I had to do was get that old land contract taken care of. So I had to use a skip tracer, track down the old borrower. He was very cooperative, fortunately, and was willing to sign off on the cancellation of contract. So I was able to get that done. It could have become, a pretty significant issue, but fortunately was able to get that worked out. So at that point, I was able to deal with the correct borrower. The loss mitigation phase. So the actual borrower who was residing in the house, he was actually a machinist, young guy, I think like 24, 25 when I started. Working as a machinist in Michigan had, pretty good salary. But this was really what I call a hard case borrower, which is pretty rare. I haven't had too many of these. So this was a situation where the guy, this was a, relatively low BPO house. I think the payment was like $350 a month, something like that. And he made, I think, at least like $50,000 a year. So more than could easily pay it, but chose not to, just wasn't interested in doing that at all. The only deal he was really willing to make was, and I think the unpaid balance was 29 or 30,000 at the time. He said, well, I'll give you 5,000 to satisfy the loan. That was all he would do. And that had actually been offered to him by a previous lender. I have no idea why on earth they would have done that, but they did. And he didn't follow through on it, right? And so he said, well, I had this deal before, I'll just give you 5,000. It was interesting because he was hard to work with, hard to get a hold of. And so I had to start the legal process. And at that point, he kind of freaked at one point in the legal process when he thought he might lose the house, and then he wanted to talk, but then he still didn't want to work anything out. Again, it was, really just kind of difficult. And then when we got down towards the end of legal, he filed bankruptcy. So this was another one that ended up in BK13, which is the restructuring bankruptcy. So he did that as a delay tactic, which drug it out very significantly. In the middle of that, he had a lot of other people living there. There were weeds. There were code enforcement issues. And code enforcement also wanted roof repairs. They wanted other structural repairs. And it was very interesting dealing with code enforcement. Had to explain to them that there's a borrower in there on a land contract. So I can't go in the property. I can't send contractors. I can't go in there and do work. And in fact, he's filed bankruptcy, so I can't even go talk to him as the lender. And they kind of pretended to not understand that, but I think really most code enforcement people do understand land contracts. And so my strategy with the code enforcement folks was to communicate with them, not blow them off, but not sign up to spend money either. And so they would follow up with me every few months, and this kind of went on and on and on throughout the BK. Eventually, we got to the point where we could get the bankruptcy dismissed because the borrower, put together a plan, never followed through on the plan, not really a big shock. And so at that point, I could restart the forfeiture process on the land contract. And right about the time I got that going was when COVID hit in March of 2020, which then shut down the courts in Michigan. And so that drug things out as well. And after a really, really long time, I was finally able to complete the forfeiture. And as this went on, I was really concerned about this deal because if you're watching the video, if you saw the earlier photos, the house looked kind of rough to begin with. And one of the code enforcement people said, he had been to the house and talked to the borrower and seemed like he was on drugs, thought he smelled things. And I was concerned I could even have like a meth lab on my hands, or at the minimum, a really messed up property. So this was one I thought was really going to get, really had a potential to get sideways on me, potentially. So this was a big timeline. So looking at reviewing kind of the timeline of this deal. So if you look from when month 0 initially bought the note, around month 4 was when I had the loan transferred. I had tracked down the old borrower, got the cancellation land contract signed. In the midst of the month 0 through 4, I was trying to do loss mitigation with the real borrower, had to give up on that because he just wasn't willing to do anything. And got the legal process going. Month 5 is when the borrower filed bankruptcy, and it took between month 5 and month 19, so about 14 months, to get through that bankruptcy process and get that dismissed and the relief of stay, which was right about when COVID hit, and so we had all kinds of delays with court shut down through COVID, and then had to pick up the forfeiture process again. And finally got the forfeiture process completed in month 30. And then in month 33, got the sale of the REO complete and got paid. And I'll give you the numbers here in a second, but the deal actually finally worked out in the end. But I think, this is an important deal to highlight, because when I first started to learn notes in this mastermind that I was a part of at the time, that guru would say, non-performing note deals should take 12 to 18 months. And many of them do, but that's if everything goes smoothly. Non-performing notes can easily take 2 to 3 years, depending on how much of a pain the borrower is going to be, what state you're in, if you hit unusual situations. So really, you should go into non-performing notes, assuming it might take you a pretty good time to get paid. All right, so let's take a look at how some of the numbers turned out. So the total cost basis that I had was about $24,000 when it was all said and done. So I paid $11,234 for the note. The total holding costs, before you look at all the legal fees related to the 2 forfeitures, getting a cancellation of the old land contract, all the bankruptcy expenses, forced place insurance over 3 years, delinquent taxes over 3 years, servicing fees over 3 years, due diligence costs, everything else that comes up, $12,835. So I actually spent more in expenses on this note than I did on the note itself. So, even though this is a contract for deed in Michigan, where, they can go pretty fast in general, I ended up with some pretty exorbitant expenses. However, sold the property for right around $50,000. So after selling costs and other things and some deductions from the county and things, might have been some code fines, I netted a little over $44,000 in proceeds, which was great. So I ended up with just over $20,000 in profits, which made it for an 83% ROI. And I didn't actually calculate the annualized, but if you look at this from a JV perspective, so I had a JV on this one. So the JV originally put up $22,000 for funding. The borrower actually had sent in a couple payments at one time, so it was 436 interest splits, and then a little over $10,000 in profit splits. So overall JV return was 47.8%. However, this was over a 3-month timeline. So they put in $22,000 in the beginning, and then in month 33 got their payout. So the annualized return was 15.4% to the JV, and obviously you double that if you were doing it with your own money. So this was a pretty good deal overall. Definitely a lot of work and a lot of headaches. That's the other rub, was I had a lot of time sunk into this. Overall, I was just very thankful that I didn't end up upside down at the end of all this, which I thought there was a decent chance that I would. I did have some clean out expenses as well in there, but overall it was left in kind of reasonable shape. So that was good. So, what did I learn over these 2 deals? I like to think of like Jerry Springer and his final thought. So what did we learn today? Well, there's quite a bit in these. Number one, when the borrower files bankruptcy, it can take a lot of time and it can be very expensive. So bankruptcies can really drag out your timeline for sure. And they also will rack up your legal expenses. When you're going into non-performing note deals, if somebody tells you to expect 12 to 18 month timelines, understand you're only getting that if everything goes pretty smoothly, and you should not be counting on that. So if you're doing ROI calculations, don't just assume that 18 months is your worst case. Understand, hey, if this thing drags out for 36 months, what is that going to do with your returns? You're going to be able to live with that. The third lesson, of course, that the unexpected can happen at any time, right? I mean, when I went into this deal in 2018, I was not thinking that a global pandemic might hit that would shut down the courts for several months and drag out my timeline. But unknown unknowns can hit you all the time. And when you're dealing with code enforcement, who was kind of a pain on this one, You do want to communicate with them. You want them to know that you're not ignoring them. You're going to be responsive. However, you don't want to be too responsive, and you don't want to be too quick to pay fines or spend money on the property, because if you're too quick about it, then they might get the impression you're going to be their out-of-state piggy bank, and that's not a good thing either. And maybe that's a good topic to dig into in more depth on another day. So that's what I got for you in this episode. In the meantime, for more info on note investing, reach out to me. You can find me at fusionnotes.com. Please check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/fusionnotes. And don't forget the webinar that's coming up soon. So thanks a lot for listening. Really appreciate it. I will see you next time.